Hello.
Hi, Jeff. Hello. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Yes. I think the last time we saw each other was in Australia a couple of years ago.
Oh my God, that's probably true.
Yeah.
I think that's true. Yeah, and this is very exciting. So
Yeah, no, it is. Thanks. Thanks a lot. It's really it's great. I mean, it's interesting because it gave me pause. It was a good moment when I heard when you sent me, would I be interested in doing it? I was actually out of town on retreat and a sort of semi-retreat, so it was good. Gave me some time to think a little bit about it. And yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So why don't we just jump in?
Okay. Yeah.
So what I wanted to talk to you about was the time that you had spent, because I had heard these stories from you some years ago about a summer that you spent, I think, having daily walks with the great Nisargadatta. And this would have been before the publication of his famous book, I Am That, and before he became as world famous as he later would. So maybe first of all, if you could just tell me, what's the time frame that we're talking about for these encounters?
Yes. Well, the first time I met him, I think, was 1977. I was 23, I think. Yeah. Oh, no, 22. And then I met him twice, actually. I spent 2 periods with him. And interestingly, the second time was after I Am That had been published in the West. So it was completely different. The little tiny room was packed. But the first time, as you said, it was before that. It was published in India, but it wasn't in the West. And there was literally no one there.
And how had you heard of Nisargadatta at that time?
I was living in India. I'd been there about 3 years and 2 years, something like 2.5 years. And by that point, I was very young, but I was a passionate seeker. I didn't even know when I went to India that's what I was, but I was very compelled to go. And I think, I had studied Asian philosophy, South Asian philosophy and language and Sanskrit and everything. So I had something in me was calling me there. And when I was there, by that point, I was living in South India, in Tiruvannamalai, which again was a very undiscovered place at that point, very quiet. It was very different to now. And there were probably about 6 of us, 6 Westerners who were living there at the time, over a period of a few years.
And I was just for those people who might not know, that is where Rama and Maharshi's ashram is.
That's right. Yes.
So that's why it's well known today and now has many travelers.
Many travelers. I think there are literally, I've heard, thousands there in the winter now, literally. It's become, and it's a very powerful, it's an extraordinary place. So I'm not surprised. But I was there, before decades ago, and I was there really because of Rama Maharshi and his teaching. I'd come across that, and of course he was no longer there. He'd passed away in 1950, but his ashram was extraordinary and still is, and very, very powerful, very focused place. And so I was there studying his teachings and really doing a lot of solitary retreats, like weeks and months. It was such a very not isolated place, but it was very remote in a certain way, and very simple. The life, it was really simple. So it was perfect for sadhana. And I was doing that. And one day someone there, one of the other people who were living there, came up and gave me the manuscript or the book of I Am That, thrust it in. At the time I was living in this little hut. We were all living in little huts, and I didn't even have electricity, but I started reading this book, Jeff, I Am That, and I literally couldn't put it down. And I think I read the whole thing in one reading practically, or overnight. I know it was overnight. And by the next morning, I just felt, I realized he was still alive, and that was a lot of the great masters had passed on. And I thought, you know, I'm going to go see him. So I made my way to Mumbai, to Bombay, which was Bombay then. And that's how I came to see it. It was immediate for me, because the transmission from that book, as you know, is so powerful, and it's as powerful now as it was then.
Right, absolutely. It's certainly, I mean, it's one of the timeless classics of both Advaita Vedanta and just enlightenment literature in general. Absolutely.
Yes, no, it really is. And I think, I was just looking at it again, actually, today, because I knew we were going to do just have this talk. And it was very interesting, because that's a translation. That's an English translation. He spoke a Marathi, right? His local language. And the transmission is direct. And in fact, my experience of being with him, it's funny, Jeff, I can't even remember it being translated. I had a very, very good translator, Mr. Patan, very lovely man, who came and translated. But yeah, it comes through the English as well.
Beautiful. So describe for us the initial meeting. So obviously you had to travel quite a distance.
Yes. That's
I
right.
imagine you were doing it on an Indian train, and probably not first class.
Definitely not first class. No, I think it took a couple of days to get there. Even Tiruvannamalai in those days, it was a 5-hour bus ride to Madras, and then the train. And but it was, that was how we did it then. I mean, it was a very, very different time. And sometimes I find it hard to, because I go back to India, remember how different. There was no internet, there were no phones, you know, it was you're really in a different place. And,
well, it's interesting, just as an aside, there's a couple of reasons I wanted to do this interview with you. One, because you had such a unique opportunity to spend time with Nisargadatta, and I feel like there's so many people that would benefit from hearing about your experience and gaining the insight from a first-hand account of such a great saint. And second of all, because there's, you know, unlike, you know, you were a very early pioneer of Eastern spirituality, and, you know, sounds like you were traveling to India when you were 20 years old, 19 or 20 years old.
21, I think, yeah.
21, and living there at a time when, yes, it wasn't anything like it is today, where, you know, everybody has their cell phones now, and there's cars everywhere, and the internet is all over. It was even before the first days when I went to India, when, you know, you had those little STD booths everywhere.
Yes,
at least
right.
You could fax. You know?
Exactly.
I was a late traveler comparatively.
Right.
You know, you were there when it really was very remote, and so it must have been, even to be in India in those days, you must have really felt remote and quite separate from the Western world, quite out of touch with people in the West. I mean, I don't even know how you would communicate with people if you wanted to.
That's right. It was that's very true. I mean, literally the only way you could communicate was every few months. If you knew where you were going to land in a big city or a big town, they had what they call post restant, which is where they had a place that Westerners could receive mail. You would go there and pick up your mail every few months. So it was I mean, now I feel I was so lucky, Jeff, and really privileged in a way to be able to have that experience, because there was one of the things around it that made it so powerful was that there was no reference point that was familiar.
Right.
And that was I think, very helpful, actually, because the usual things that we grab hold of, you know, to mediate our experience or to interpret it really weren't there. And I had actually chosen to go by myself too. That was a conscious decision. Partly for that reason, is I really wanted, and funny you said I was a pioneer, but I was following people like Paul Brunton and John Blofield, right. And they were my inspiration. And I was a little bit after actually Ram Dass, a little after them. So yeah, I was in that period, but yeah, the simplicity and the remoteness, I think, really helped in a way. If you're a seeker, it was challenging too, but there was something, it opened you up in a way that I think was really, really helpful.
It really created an opportunity to let go of
Yes,
everything familiar. And,
absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't travel to India until 1993, so it was almost 2 decades after your first visits.
Right.
But even then, it was like entering a magic kingdom.
Yes.
And you immediately felt like you had no connection home. I mean, you couldn't find an STD booth in fax.
That's right. Yes.
If you wanted to, but compared to the way that we're connected today, you felt pretty much like you could drift off and disappear and nobody would know it.
That's right.
There's something very liberating about that fact that you were really very off the grid. And
that's right.
So at the time when you were there, I mean, you were really off the grid.
No, that's right. That's really true. And there was a sense of incredible, freedom in that, I think, and no horizon in a way. It was way open, and I was fortunate, I think, because I felt very at home in that. Almost immediately in India, even though it felt very strange on one hand, it was a completely different culture, but I also felt deeply at home, which I think was,
right,
really good.
And so before you traveled to see Nisargadatta, you were living in a hut, which I picture as sort of a one-room little hut.
Yes.
And I imagine that you were mostly doing spiritual practice and then, doing the things you have to do to get food and to keep clean and etc. But that basically you were living a life of sort of a solitary practitioner, almost a monk.
Yes, that's right. Yes. In fact, I had exactly that. I had a little hut. It was a thatched hut. It was adobe. It was an outside well. It was a few hundred meters from the Rama Ashram down. There were 2 little lanes at that point, which now are very populated, but then they weren't. And it was there was a bigger house building in the compound, and this was a little hut. And I was very lucky because I had a friend, an Indian woman, who made food once a day. And so, I ate that and fruit. So everything was very minimal, distraction wise. So it was a perfect place to do practice and to just give yourself completely to I mean, it was an amazing time, Jeff. I mean, people were totally on fire with that. It was a wonderful opportunity, and I would read a little bit every day of Ramana's teachings as a kind of take me in a way. And then
And what was your experience of practice like at that time?
It was amazing, actually. I had started with I'd done some Theravada practice, Buddhist practice initially. That's what, in a way, I guess was my first real experience of meditation and discipline. That's as you know, it's very disciplined. And I appreciated I'd done that for a couple of years or a year and a half, something like that, and done some pretty long, extensive retreats. And I felt like that had helped me to learn to focus and to sit quietly still. And I struggled with that initially because I was so young, but I actually had a fairly powerful experience early on in that practice. And so then that gave me the motivation and the passion, really. And so by the time I was in Tiruvannamalai, I loved it. I was young. My body was, very flexible and everything. So I would just, it felt like a time of extraordinary depth and exploration, and it was very exciting.
And you were there before you got the copy of I Am That delivered to you, you'd already been there for a couple of years.
No, about a year, I think, maybe about a year. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I was there about 3 years, I think, out of the time I was in India. Yeah, in Tiruvannamalai, I was in India longer, but yeah.
Okay. And so at some point after a year, a friend gave you a copy of I Am That, the Indian edition, prior to the English one being printed, and you realized that this was a master who was living.
Yes.
And so you took the 5-hour bus ride
Yes.
Up to Madras, and then however many hours train ride.
I think a couple of days, to be honest.
Couple of days.
In those days, yes. Yeah.
To Bombay.
Yes.
And so then just walk us through that initial meeting.
Yes. Well, I found his address. I can't remember how I did. It was in the book or whatever. But he was living in a fairly poor. It was a poor area of Bombay at the time. And I went to his place, and it was a big tenement building. And I don't know if your listeners know, but he was not an educated person formally, and he had been he had a little shop, corner store, which is very, very common in India, and they sell. And he was known as the beedi wala. Actually, that's what people used to call him, because he sold these little Indian cigarettes called beedis. But by the time I saw him, he was already 80, I think, or 79. And he wasn't doing that, his son was. But he lived above the shop. So he lived in this quite dark, at the time, tenement building. And I entered this building, and I found the apartment that he was. And I knocked on the door, and I'll never forget this. It was his daughter, actually, who opened the door. And I had bought some oranges, right, to give him. And she just pointed upstairs, and she took me in, and what they had done is built him. It was quite a small apartment, so there was a mezzanine. They built a mezzanine floor, and there was quite steep staircase going up. So I went up the staircase, and it was actually amazing, because he was sitting there. He was on the floor on a mat it was traditional sort of animal skin, I think, but he was sitting on the floor just cross-legged, and he looked over to me, and he has these amazing eyes, very penetrating, bright eyes, and he was quite a small person. And it was amazing, Jeff, because I had never done this before. I wasn't a particularly devotional person, but I immediately touched his feet, and I don't know why I did that, but I did. It was without thought. And I gave him my oranges, and I spoke Hindi a little bit. So we spoke, and he said, he was beautiful. He was very welcoming, and he said to come back a bit later in the morning. I must have been there early in the morning, because I think he said come back like on 10 o'clock or mid-morning. So I did that. I went back down. We talked a little bit, I think, and I came back, and then that's right. He meanwhile had called the translator, who was a really nice man. He's no longer, but his name was Mr. Patan, very humble, very beautiful Marathi man. And he came every day to translate.
That's amazing. So at that time, I Am That had been published in India, but it doesn't sound like Nisargadatta was a particularly well-known teacher if he was just living above the smoke shop and there was nobody there.
Yeah, I mean, there were Indian people did come. He had Indian disciples. So I can't, to be honest, I think a couple people came during the period I was there. I think I was there 2-3 weeks. There wasn't any Westerners, and Mr. Patan came every day. But what he did have, and this was really, really amazing, is I discovered after a few days, he invited me to come really early in the morning, like at 6 or something, because he had these sort of dialogues at inquiry periods at 10. And he invited me to come for the early morning, and it was utterly different. And I went up there, and there's these sort of loud bhajans and people banging cymbals and lots of incense, and it was full of the local neighborhood people.
In his house?
In his little mezzanine. Yeah. Okay. They were all there, and he was sitting up. I mean, he was always sitting on the floor when he worked with people, but he was sitting up on this chair in a corner, and they were, sort of listening to him. He would give a teaching on one of the texts, on one of the scriptures every morning. And then they would do this big sort of celebration of, you know, bhajans and things and banging and lots of incense, and then that would be it. So I would go to that, and it was, you could barely hear anything. You know, it was so loud and completely different. But he did that for the local people because he was their guru. So, and he would fulfill the function of that too, I think, after. I mean, I can't remember everything, but I remember he would also talk to them, and they would, you know, bring their stories to him and ask him for their blessings, etc., etc. So he performed that, and he told me later that yeah, he kind of was aware he had different roles at different times for different people. Yeah.
And so that was an early morning sort of daily service.
Yes.
For the local people.
Yes.
And then you would meet with him again a little later on.
Yes, although because I think there was no one else really around, and because I was there, I think I was really very lucky, Jeff, very fortunate, because he invited me often to stay, because after that his daughter would bring him up his breakfast, which was really a bowl of suji or something, you know, some gruel, and he would eat that, and sometimes he would share that with me. You know, he's incredibly sweet, really sweet. So I would be sitting there. This is probably about 6 or 7 days in, once he'd got to know me a little bit. And then we would go for a walk often, just go down into the bazaar, and he'd take a little walk, and he had a little cap on, his Marathi cap, and he had his stick. And it was very sweet, again, because I was probably the only Westerner for a long, you know, in that neighborhood. We always had a bunch of little kids, you know, following us, and he'd wave his stick at them and, you know, pretend to be fierce. And it was very sweet. There was an intimacy and sweetness. And then we'd go back, and then we would start to talk.
And when you'd go for a little walk, and you go through the bazaar. So I imagine that, you know, imagine India was pretty bustly, at least Mumbai was probably pretty bustly at the time.
Yeah.
And did you talk during your walk, or were you just walking in silence?
No. Yeah, we just, well, it was not really silent because everything was so noisy.
Of course, right.
But we weren't engaged in conversation, because also my Hindi wasn't that good to be able to really do that. But he would comment on things, and, you know, we'd buy some biscuits, or, you know, this sort of thing. We'd chat in that way, but comment on things, etc. And yeah, that was and then we'd go back, and I think we went straight into really talking then.
So you would go back, and then when you got back and you'd sit down, the translator would be there.
Yes, yeah. Or his daughter would bring up some chai, and then the translator would come. Yeah, and then they would.
And then when you were in those private conversations after the walk in the bazaar, was it you were more or less having spiritual discussions with him?
Completely, yeah.
And what do you remember about what you were sharing with him, and what he was sharing with you then?
Well, it was interesting, Jeff, because right from the start, because what I just described to you was as I think, probably got to know each other. And again, it's 44 years ago. I can't remember the exact time frame, but when I first started to meet him, that first day when I met him, and then he said, come back, he was just absolutely ready to go. That's how he approached it. It wasn't casual. It wasn't, you know, it was just, he was really ready to go. It wasn't formal in a sense that, you know, now I'm the teacher. You know, he was very unself-conscious, beautiful person, but he would sit, and I would sit right on the floor in front of him. And he would just, in the beginning, what my memory was, I had been doing all this practice, right, this deep practice, and I'd had quite a lot of experiences, different types of experiences, but I really felt like I wanted the full, what I thought of as the full experience, you know, the full knowledge, or the full awakening. And so I don't remember exactly, to be honest, the dialogues, but I remember sharing everything with him. I was just pouring out, and he was really surprised, I think, because I was so young and I was Western. So He was surprised at that. I remember he was commenting to Mr. Patan about that, how young I was, that I was so, I had so many questions too. Yeah.
So when you say that you were pouring everything out, you were talking about your spiritual life and your experiences and what you were thinking about and your journeys and travels and just everything?
No, not my journeys and travels. It was literally about more the kind of practice I was doing. It was, not about the practice, but the questions that were emerging from that.
And then he was responding to everything that you brought up.
Yeah.
And so
completely, he listened. He really listened, and what he did was he would really listen. And then my memory was he would ask a question. He really wanted to understand where you were coming from, and he would ask questions in a way that would then really open things up. And a lot of my memory was, it was very interrogative. The way he got you to inquire, he would ask questions, and then I would respond, and he would respond. Yeah.
I see. And so how long did this go on, where you would, go for morning walks and then have these more focused meetings afterwards?
I think it was every day. My memory was, it was every day for about 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks. I mean, I think sometimes I didn't go for the walk every day. Sometimes I might go off and have breakfast myself and then come back. It was very unfixed in a way, open. But I would always get there at 10 if I wasn't just staying there with him. And that was when he did that. And if other people came, because I think later on, definitely there were other people, a second visit. But the first one, I think there were some Indian came at different times to ask him questions but not very often. I don't my memory is it was almost unbroken, but yes, but there were. So he would be on, he would really ready to go every time you came in. And I would, by then too, obviously from being with him, Jeff, things were moving, things were actually happening within my own consciousness, just from the power. I am thinking back to it. There was a sense he was so utterly awakened. So that transmission that we get still from that book was the experience of being with him. So he evoked, that's all I can think of it. He evoked the depth from yourself, right? The deepest you sort of met. And I think over the period, thinking about it, I remember my experience was being utterly met, right?
And I guess what I want to ask you now, and I find the whole thing very moving. I mean, I guess maybe a more minor question is, to what extent did you, because now, if you look at it now, right, it's 2019, I Am That is a spiritual classic, almost without parallel,
yes.
for in its time. And Nisargadatta is a legendary saint of the 20th century. So you look at it now and you think, oh my God, you spent 2.5 weeks with him every day. And so if anyone were offered the opportunity to go back in time and do that, that would be a priceless opportunity.
Absolutely. Yes.
And so I'm just wondering, to what extent were you aware of how priceless an opportunity you were in the middle of when you were there with him?
Interesting. I'm not sure, because I think I was aware of that it was a very precious time. That way, I had no idea that he was going to become that famous, or I didn't have that kind of context for it, and I wasn't thinking really in that way. But I was really aware I was with a master. I mean, there was no doubt. And I also, the other thing, Jeff, is I had this deep love for him. He could be very intimidating. Actually, he was very, very direct. He was very direct. And I think some people were later on, the second visit. I saw that could be this case. because he would really say what he felt, and he didn't suffer any fools. He didn't suffer inauthenticity at all. He was very direct, but he was not aggressive. There was nothing aggressive in his being, but he would really say it as it was.
Mm-hmm.
And, if someone was, one of the things that he insisted was really important was sincerity. He didn't say that you have to be sincere or anything like that, but that's at another time in a conversation, he said, well, I can't remember exactly the words, but basically all it took was a guru, and for the seeker, or to be utterly intent, utterly earnest. That's all it took. He felt that was essential. You didn't have to do anything else. You didn't have to know anything, but you really had to be, and so had to be sincere in that way, or earnest. And if you weren't, or if there was a shadow of someone trying to play intellectual games, anything like that, he would call it out immediately. But in a way, the way he did that, Jeff, and that was also how he worked. He did it in a way that you would understand that was an obstruction to what you're really there for, and what you're really looking for. And he did it in that way. So it was always an amazing teaching. I never saw him put anyone down. I certainly didn't experience that.
And so, because clearly that was many years ago now,
yes. Mm-hmm.
And you've lived a spiritual life ever since, in different forms. Looking back at it now, how did that time affect you? What did you get from Nisargadatta and from that incredibly intimate opportunity to work with him at such a young age, such a formative time in your path?
Right. I think it has probably been one of the major impacts of my life, actually. I've thought about that, and obviously you and I met when we were both students of Andrew Cohen, which was another very impactful time, and a lot had happened between those two. But I see that period, because I don't know when, it was probably a weekend, whatever. I actually had this very, very profound, whatever one calls it, Satori awakening experience, right? So then from then on in, after that, that's where we were really talking from and about and in, and that was amazing. So that actually really happens. And I think that it wasn't just the experience of that, but it was the whole experience of being with him. Jeff, he was, when you were with him, it was almost impossible to resist that. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't resist him as a person, but it was resist that. And it's interesting, his teaching is, I am that, and he was that. And so one's own experience of being that, was very tangible, right? And I think that, so and I feel, I don't think I've always sort of been cognizant of it throughout my entire life, but it left an indelible, I feel, that period. And then obviously later on I had, took things on with Andrew, but I think it left an indelible trust and knowledge, deep prior knowledge, not a knowledge in my mind, but a deep trust and knowledge, pre-thinking, pre-thought knowledge of the self, really, or whatever one calls it, God, whatever. But that, I feel incredibly, I was very, very, very unbelievably fortunate and privileged to have that time and that with him, because he was such a master. And that I think has given me, and look, my life has not always been, I would say, definitely a reflection of that, an expression of that, but it has been, there's a foundation or something there that has never left me. So yeah, and guides my life. I think my whole life has been
right,
really exploring that and looking at what the relationship between that and life really is, and so it started with him, put it that way. It was an indelible foundation.
And I guess what strikes me is what you're describing is that at that period of your life gave you an indestructible confidence in the ultimate. You knew it.
Yes.
Like you said, you may or may not have had contact with it at all times, but you never doubted its existence. You know, it touched you deeply enough to bring you to a place beyond doubt.
Yes.
And that's very powerful. And you know, none of us are perfect, of course. And yet, if I, you know, from what I know you quite well, and I thinking about your life, in many ways, it is an expression of that kind of faith, because, you know, it's rare for someone to be as single-pointedly focused to spiritual pursuit as you have been for 4 decades, really without a break. So that amount of pursuit, regardless of, you know, the relative ups and downs of, you know, this year versus last year, the consistency of that pursuit over 4 decades. I mean, people don't even stay in the same job for 4 decades.
Right.
Never mind stay single-pointedly focused on the pursuit of awakening that, you know, that you get no cultural or social support for. And especially in the early days when you were doing it, there was even less. You know, it's a little easier today because there's a little bit more social agreement around the fact that this is a valuable thing to do. But yeah, I think it's pretty remarkable the way that experience catapulted a life dedicated to the divine.
No, that's interesting, Jeff. Yeah, I think that's true. I think that I think that time in India, of which I would say my time with Nisargadatta was really core to that, to what you're saying, to get to, you know, allowing me to let go enough, really, because of as I was saying, you know, the strength of his own transmission, but the awakening power that had, the evocative power that had, and then the kind of deep trust, knowledge that's never gone. And as you were saying, but I think it was also being in India, and it's interesting what you said, that now there's more support for that, whereas I'm not sure if I totally would see it that way.
I question it myself.
It was a different era, and there was, I mean, it was Ginsburg, it was, you know, it was a different time, and so people all over the West and the East were, I mean, when I first went to India, I had no idea I was part of a generation that this was happening. It was a consciousness explosion going on, an inquiry. Everyone was looking, and I didn't know. When I left, I was Australian, right? None of my friends, they were far more political. It was when the Vietnam War was going on, and they were more political. I didn't have many friends who had that same interest. But when I got to India, I realized, whoa, there's people from all over here, and many of them came and went, and some got very involved in lots of different things. You know, there's a lot of drugs at the time and all of that. And some people really went off the rails, actually, but got quite lost. But I felt that we were part of a period in history that exploring consciousness. See, I was in India for 7 years, which you can never do now. That's the other thing I feel incredibly grateful for. I was able to have that time. You know, I left university. I went to university. I worked, left. That was what I did. And there were a lot of people doing that. It was a less utilitarian time in a way too. So people were just doing it because they felt that was really important. Right? There was something
a more idealistic time.
It was a more idealistic time. And so then by the time I left India and went west, I went, and anyway, that's a whole nother story, but lived in a community of people who I had met in India and who'd also been in Thailand as monks and nuns, and had gathered in the West, right, to do that. So I didn't feel unsupported. And plus, most of the people who went through India, there was very few people doing other things other than, a lot was studying music, but that again was in a context of a guru-disciple relationship, or they were seeking deeply, even if they didn't think they were, really, which I was actually one of those. So yeah, I think it was a period that I think helped. There was something about what was happening in the period. In fact, it was very funny because Steve and I just watched, there's a new film out by Scorsese on Dylan's road trip. Do you remember that?
Oh,
Rolling Thunder.
yeah, I have not seen the movie, but I do know it exists.
We watched it and I was just like, wow, you know, that was a period. There's a kind of innocence and joy and excitement and exploration, and being together was what it was about, you know.
Right.
And they were doing it within the music field and, you know, obviously exploring everything from that. But
that's beautiful. I'm so glad that you brought this up, because I think there's a double-edged sword, right? Because of course, so I mean, I just to say, you know, you and I for 2 decades were living together in spiritual community, and you know, I always see you as, I mean, the best thing that I can say is you're sort of my older spiritual sister, and I have so much respect, you know, for your life and what you've done, and how I've benefited from knowing you. And I'm aware that, you know, when I got started, you know, in the early 90s, which was much later than you, it was still this was all a little bit fringy, especially if you were going to take it to the extreme of joining a spiritual community and leaving the world, which, you know, not that many people were doing, and still not that many people do. But 15, 20 years earlier, when you were going to India, of course, there was even less people doing it. So, you know, you had to be even more kind of maverick in a certain way. And of course, you were building on, as you said, a whole history of people who had gone, you know, waves that goes all the way back to the transcendentalists and their love for the East. They didn't never travel to the East. It wasn't even really possible then, but they were certainly translating and reading the Upanishads and just getting into this. So we're all building and building and building on each. And over time, you know, the Eastern spiritual traditions have become much more popular in the West, obviously with the exploding popularity of yoga, and more recently the rise in popularity of meditation, and some incredible people who were sort of part of your generation of travelers to India have successfully brought some of these Indian ideas into maybe not mainstream Western culture, but, you know, certainly a larger sphere of Western culture. And so on the one hand, you could look at that and say, well, there's more support for these ideas because, you know, there's plenty of books you can read, and there's yoga studios all over the place, and there are a lot of people who are teaching. On the other hand, like you're saying, that there's a magic of that earlier period where people were having to take such extreme action to pursue it, which brings you together like a band at the, you know, you're a band sort of beyond the edge of the norm, and it brings that sort of idealistic spirit and the shared camaraderie and I can kind of imagine what it was like to be part of that kind of magic in India in the early days, when also I think there was a lot more innocence around some of these ideas, and maybe also some naivety, you know, that was you know, needing to be burned away. But on the positive side, innocence, and it's an extraordinary time. And then you had 7 years to be steeped in that kind of culture is really quite an extraordinary opportunity.
Definitely. No, I totally feel that, Jeff. I feel, like I said, when I think about it now, and I think I still see it a little differently in a certain way, because when you say that at that time we had to be more maverick, more in a certain way, that one hand you could say that's true, because I mean, I didn't see my family for 7 years, right? And it was quite radical. But I think there was something happening in the consciousness of the time that provoked that radical without you even thinking this is really radical. It was almost like, I know for myself, it was, when I left, I had a boyfriend, and I was in university, I had university friends. but I really want to go alone. And I wanted to go alone. I didn't even know why, but I knew that I needed to find something, meet something, and that it would be easier to do that on my own than constantly referring, to someone from my own culture. It was a sort of instinct, really. And I think that, interesting enough, at the time, more people took time out than they do now. It was just a different era. And I think a lot of people now have to fit in their spiritual life or the spiritual practice into some other life. Whereas at that point, it was the counterculture, right? It was when counterculture sort of explosion was taking place. So there was a lot of rebellion against living a normal life. So in a way, I was part of that wave that was looking to say, hey, we don't want to go down the straight and narrow way at this point. We want to find something really different as a ground for something new, for a new kind of normal, so to speak. So in a way, it was, was my experience then, although I think you're right. There was far less facilities, there was far less support. You couldn't ring home. If you ran out of money, you were in big trouble, all of these kind of things. But it was also incredibly inexpensive to live there then. But there was a kind of freedom, but people felt they were really also, I think, wanting to create a different culture. And I think that when you said to me that a little earlier in this conversation, you said that for 4 decades, I've sort of been a seeker in a way. I think it's been not quite that. I think that time in India, one of the things of being there was that, not that it brought seeking to an end, but that especially that time with Nisargadatta, in a way did, in a strange way. And in fact, I just want to tell you a very short follow-up story to my time with him. Is I went back after I had this sort of 2.5 whatever weeks. I wasn't quite sure what I was meant to do, right? Because I went back to Tiruvannamalai and I continued to live the kind of life I was, which was really, doing an enormous amount of practice. But it was a little different. And I was trying to remember what was different. And I think it was because I wasn't seeking. I didn't know that at the time, but something had gotten blown out, that this sense of lack or sense of whatever it is that propels you wasn't there anymore. So it was almost like, but I was so young, I didn't know what to do with that. So I continued and I was reading and I was meditating, hours, but there was something that was a little different. So at a certain point I went back to see him. And that was the following year. And the book had been published and the little room was full of people, just sort of stacked all around. And when I went in the door, he saw me and I remember he lit up, actually. He recognized me, right? And he smacked the floor right in front of him. He sort of banged on the floor and sit down and sort of, I can't remember, but asked me what was happening. And I sort of opened up, and what I opened up with were really my doubts. I mean, I didn't think of them as that. I thought they were sort of valid questions, but they were coming from this place of something's wrong, right? I'm not quite sure where I am, and da-da-da. And it was really fascinating, Jeff, because this also reveals something else about his teaching and the way he taught. He was very angry. He exploded. And I was totally taken aback. And he said something very, very simple. He said something along the lines of, if it's hot in Bombay, and he sort of shouted it. And when it's hot in Bombay, it's really, really hot, right? He said, you go to the mountains. That was it. And that was the teaching, right? And I was stunned by his anger, and I was young. So I think I was far more focused on that and probably what I felt about it and all of that. And anyway, that was it. And he kind of left me with that. And I think, and then a day later or whatever, he looked at me again. He looked at me and, I was sick. I came back in and I was part of, there was probably 20, 30 people in the room, 15 people in the room. And he saw at me and he looked at me very directly. And he said, I trusted my guru. I trusted his words. When he said I was free, I trusted it. And I know. And I felt he was really telling me something, that he was giving me another teaching. And he said it took, I think he said it took him 3 years, something like that. But I never doubted his words. And much later, at that time, I was so young and I was very, in a certain way, immature. Obviously, I didn't have much experience of understanding the process, even though I was in it. I realized that from his perspective, there were two things. Earnestness, this absolute earnestness, he always said was really mandatory, imperative. But also that you trusted your guru, or you trusted the teaching, or you trusted your own experience of self. And I realized that's what he was responding to. And he was really like a Zen master in that way. It was almost like a koan. It was like, and I realized what he was saying to me in a way was like, the sky's blue, you don't doubt that. You know it's blue, right? So he was really extraordinary in that way. And yeah.
When he said when it's hot in Mumbai, you go to the mountains. How would you now explain what that teaching was? What was he trying to convey to you with that?
What I understood it was that he was saying, look, that was just saying the sky. If the sky is blue, or if the table's, the plant is green or whatever, then you don't question that. You know that. You don't know that. You don't, you respond, in other words. If it's hot, you respond, right? You don't have a conversation and a doubt about it being hot. So I think that's what I understood. He was pointing to the fact he was really, he was disclosing the kind of doubts and confusion that I had wound round my experience of the time, which, as you said, and I think, we've both probably been through so many times over the years, is you're not always quite in touch with or have access to that, to who we are, really, in an ongoing experiential way. But, that had obviously happened. That experience had faded, the experience of that knowledge, but the knowledge hadn't. It was very interesting, which is why I think I had this disquiet. I couldn't just practice as a seeker, because something had happened that had taken that away. I knew, not with my mind, but with my being.
Yes.
It had been met. And so I was kind of peeling back and going back in, and he wouldn't engage me on those terms because they weren't real terms from his perspective.
I think that's such a powerful teaching, because basically what he's saying is, if it's hot in Mumbai, you go to the mountains, right? So in other words, it might be hot, you might not like it, it might not be what you want, but you just go to the mountains. You don't make a big deal about it. You don't make a problem out of it. You don't question the validity of it. You just respond and keep it simple, problematic and simple. And we, because we have these incredible powers of self-observation and also habits of self-criticism and doubt, we will tend to get in a whole inner discussion because all of a sudden it's not the way I wanted it to be, or not the way I thought it was going to be. And rather than just accepting that and responding, I want to get into a whole conversation with myself and anyone who will listen about why it shouldn't be this way, or my doubts about why it's this way. And I think it's a very interesting, simple, direct, sounds a bit fierce in a positive sense, teaching that he was delivering. And I can almost feel it when you say it, his initial excitement at seeing you, and then your expression of doubt and how disappointing it would be. From his memory, because it sounds like when you were with him before, you were so open. And
that's exactly
so
right.
Mm-hmm.
And I came back with my mind, exactly as you said, with the sort of, and it was the classic thing. And it took many, many, many years for me to really, and I think it's very common to understand that your experience, the experience you're actually happening at any one moment, doesn't necessarily mean anything. We have all kinds of experiences. And it was just, I think I was so young at the time that experience of, totally liberating experience of fullness and self, I thought that was going to be it forever that way. And
right, of course.
Exactly. So it was, Yeah, so it was many, many years later that I, in fact, it was during our time together, really, that time, the time we shared, you know, and in the community, that I began to understand that whole movement.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the second visit to Nisargadatta, which, so these were the two times when you spent time with him.
Yes.
How long was the second visit? And now it was in the context of being part of a growing community. How long were you seeing him that second time?
I think it was about a week. I think 10 days. It was over a period, and I was, that's right.
I see.
It wasn't. Yeah, and he was working with a lot of people, so I also got to see him work with other people, and which was also very powerful, right? And the interesting thing, Jeff, about Nisargadatta that I consider he's such a master too, is that he wasn't fixed. I mean, people, it's true, his teaching was I am that, right? That's his book. And everything about it, he was wanting people to awaken to that experience, and that's how he expressed it, that sense of I am that, non-separate from that, right? But the way he worked with people was completely, it was utterly fluid. It depended on who was in front of him. You know, so people would ask, should I do this? Should I do that? Should I? And it would be a different response every time, but according to where the person was and what he saw was needed. He wanted them to wake up. So if someone was naturally drawn to a certain path, he would encourage them to do that till it was finished, it was over. But again, he was encouraging people in every which way to give everything to that. You know, he felt that's all you needed, really. So it didn't matter if you did no practice, didn't matter what practice you did, you know, obviously within reason, but so he was totally free of any kind of ideology.
That's interesting. So he wasn't teaching a specific practice, say, in the way that Ramana Maharshi was tending to teach the, you know, questioning, who am I practice, the self-inquiry practice.
No, and I do think even with Ramana Maharshi, from everything I've read and people, because when I lived there, again, I was really very lucky, Jeff, very, very fortunate, because there were still people alive then who had been with him. Right? He died 24 years before, I was 26 years before. And so there were a lot of stories. You could spend time with these very old people who would, you know, just, it was gorgeous. You know, they would share their time with Ramana. And I really got the impression from them too that he was far more fluid, right? It wasn't like you have to go off and sit in your room and do this inquiry of course, that was his practice, and that was his teaching. Just like with Nisargadatta, I am that. It expresses what that teaching points to, right? But the way he just wanted you to let go, really, to let go of the mind. Was usually for Westerners was the mind. For Indians, it was often different things, and sometimes both. You know, each way.
Right.
But often. So he wanted you to let go, whatever it was that was in the way. It could be a huge attachment to something. It could be a big fear. It might be whatever it was. But the interesting thing, my memory was that would become disclosed through the conversation with him. You'd suddenly be aware of what was blocking. And that often would be the thing that would that would be it. Yeah. So he was amazing like that. Yeah.
So, and I just want to be clear, I would never want to characterize you as having been a seeker for 40 years, because you were you were certainly a finder when we met, so to speak. But anyway, the minor point. I think I do admire the single pointedness of your focus on spiritual life for those 40 years. You know, that's what I find so. That is unusual. You know, if you take a cross section of the population, it's very few people are as single pointedly focused on living a spiritual life for that long as you have been. And when we met in the early 90s as part of the spiritual community, I came into that. You were already a figure of some prominence in the community. So someone I looked up to from the start, and then we got to be friends and colleagues, and spiritual compatriots as well as working partners for
Definitely.
many years,
Yeah.
and developed a deep love and friendship
Right.
that is was a very significant part of my own growth through that period in many ways.
Mine too, Jeff. Yeah.
And we were focused during those decades on essentially the possibility that both Ramana and Nisargadatta were espousing, which is the direct recognition that beyond the identity as being a separate individual who has a name and a birthday and characteristics of this, that, and the other thing, deeper than that, the awareness that is coming through the individual, even the awareness of being the individual, is itself a source which is universal, and which we all are. And so I am that applies equally to, it actually doesn't really apply to it's not really the individual Jeff saying, I am that, it's really that source itself recognizing what it is.
Exactly.
Through this vehicle. And I guess I wanted to ask you to reflect a little bit on that particular articulation of awakening, the one that you and I have dedicated so much of our lives to, and so much of that together. How do you see that today? What's the relevance of that awakening? And because sometimes I feel like I wish it was louder. I wish, like you were saying, in some ways I can see how today we're more supported spiritually, and in other ways less. In other ways, through familiarity, these things almost get occluded. They become a little obscure because of the familiarity, because and the true majesty of that kind of recognition, and what that means not only for the individual, but more importantly for what it brings into the world. And I love your story and my story and many other stories that I've heard, because whatever time you're in, that depth of recognition requires a profound leap beyond the familiar, a leap of faith into the unknown. And it's that leap, whether you do it leaping to India without any cell phones or internet, or you do it leaping into a spiritual community of all kinds of bizarre, where all sorts of bizarre things occur. Whatever is your version of a leap, it really requires you to leave the world of the familiar.
That's right.
If not physically, emotionally, and in terms of a reference point. You have to give up the normal reference point and allow yourself to enter into a sea of uncertainty in order to be open enough to be available for the kind of recognition that's going to radically alter everything you ever thought. And I would just love to hear you reflect on sort of the state of that kind of recognition today, the significance of it for the world. And I'm doing this interview with you because I really want to inspire people. I want to inspire them to want to let go in this way, and to feel, I loved what you said earlier. When you were doing this, it didn't feel like a risk. And when I left my career and my wife and joined a spiritual community, in retrospect, it looks like an insane risk. But at the time, it didn't feel like a risk at all. It just felt like what I had to do. And the fact that I didn't know why I had to do it was irrelevant. The compulsion was so strong. There was just no other choice. And then the question is, because I believe that many people, that compulsion is alive in many people. And some people are following it, and some people are following it to an enormous degree. But I think many more people, that there are some layers that don't allow the full bloom of that compulsion, the full bloom of their passion for divinity to manifest as the kind of leap that would potentially propel them and into this kind of realization. So that's a long introduction to the fact that I would love to hear after, look, you've got such an incredible perspective after all these years and all the things you've seen and are continuing to do even to this day. How do you see this realization? What's its place in the world, and how can it be pursued in the current times most effectively?
Yeah, big, really big questions.
Exactly.
Very big. But I think, Jeff, it's interesting because just to say, I think we recognized each other as being, when you were describing our time together, as people who, this is really what life is about. I think there's a consuming passion that is never, whether one's seeking to look for it or one has, to whatever degree, been fortunate and privileged or whatever enough to have that seeking met. It's not over then, as you know. Then I think, but what does happen is that, I think it, I mean, just to, how to go here, I think it's so core to human existence, and it contains the keys to how we can actually live together on this very complicated, very complex planet, at this time, particularly this time in life. I feel this is not just the experience, it's that there's a deep, as you know, when one's seeking, they're propelled by this passion, right? It's a passion for something. And even as you said, we don't necessarily know what that is. And that to me overwhelms the fears and the hesitations if we give ourselves to it completely, which is why I think Nisargadatta also, he didn't say that, but that's what he meant, I think, by earnestness. Utter earnestness means that you give this more, you just give yourself to it. And my sense is that it brings, one of the things it does is that it takes time, obviously, to trust that, I guess, but, and to not make the kind of mistakes I was making with him this second visit, but it provides this kind of deep, it's so deeply whole and so deeply positive without, on the most fundamental existential level, that I think it frees the human being up to really respond and be there, be present for life itself, and therefore responsive, right, to life in a very, potentially very creative way. And when I say creative way, that could take any kind of form, but I feel a lot of the issues we have today, if this was at the heart of it, if we were, more people were awakened and more of the people that were driving things, shaping things, had that awakening or had that knowledge or whatever, then things could be very different. So I'm very, very interested and always have, I think particularly the time when we spent in the community, what attracted me actually to Andrew Cohen was he was very interested fairly soon in. Initially his teaching, as you know, was very similar to the traditional Advaita Vedanta teaching of Nisargadatta Maharaj. But he very quickly, I would say within a couple of years, was interested in what was the relevance of that for human life, for life, and particularly for collective life, like what, and that really rang a bell for me. And I think, and that still is, that's what drives me. I guess endless potential, endless possibilities, endless ways that we can do things that are very related to that experience. I think it's completely relevant to the human experience and to how we can come to solutions and how we can think of new ways of being together, how we can actually be together. Because when you, as you know, part of the positive side of our experience in the community, and as you said, there were many crazy and not good sides, but the positive side is we got to experience together as a collective the potential of what can happen when you have a group of people who have stopped war. In one way to look at it, the kind of angst of being a separate person comes to an end. It doesn't mean you don't have all kind of experiences emotionally. Of course you do. We all do. but that angst, that existential angst, comes to an end. And when that comes to an end, an enormous space opens up that's very energetic, is my experience. It can be extraordinarily still, but even in that stillness, there's a kind of, potential and, dynamism to it. And I think that the nature of that consciousness is very positive. I don't mean, it's inherently integral or whole, I think. And so the way one engages with the world, the way one sees the world, is far more contextually, naturally. And you begin to see things, connections, and ways things can happen that are not coming from your own individual angst and fears and desires and, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's I think that's what we need. We need more of that in the world.
That's fantastic. Very powerful. And I want to just pick up on something as we sort of move to a close in our conversation, which I'm now seeing as, I think, probably the first of numerous that we will need to have, because there's so many things I want to keep talking about. But earlier you spoke about going to India and how lucky you felt, how grateful you felt for the fact that you arrived and there were these people there and everybody was so open and open-hearted and interested. And you were essentially, you arrived into a community of spiritually inspired individuals, and you were experiencing the benefits of that, the shared collective field of energy that was being created by such amazing people. And I was just now thinking about my own introduction to the spiritual community with Andrew Cohen, and coming into that, the thing that initially compelled me to leave my life, because I had a very normal life of White House, white picket fence,
right.
career, 2 cars, wife, the whole normal as normal can be. And over the course of about a year, I left everything. What really compelled me, like what the straw that broke the camel's back, was the first time I actually spent with the other people in the community. And I experienced something I had never experienced anywhere, which is what happens at that time. This particular gathering was about 25 people, and we were doing some work together, and I felt like being in a field of people who are like-minded in that way, and who have recognized to an extraordinary degree that this spiritual pursuit and the pursuit of divinity is what human life is about. It's somehow, as you said a minute ago, it's so integral at the core of being human. And to be with people who are recognizing that, honoring it, and devoting themselves to it, the incredible sense of upliftment and inspiration that I experienced, it was like, oh my God, why would I want to live on any other planet besides this one, the one that was being created. And of course, now that I'm, that our community is no longer together, and I'm wanting to inspire people to come together in that way, and whatever forms make sense today, because life changes, and everybody moving to a property in Western Massachusetts may not be the times anymore.
Right.
Probably for the better.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
But what's the version of coming together today that will allow us to engage in a way in which all of our earnestness and inspiration and devotion to the divine and single-pointed focus on expressing this profound degree of recognition of what's sacred will mingle together and infuse all of us, and so that it will become a kind of co-inspiring, co-creative generator for further awakening. I mean, that's the compulsion that drives me more than anything else. You know, I
Yes.
sometimes say, more than being a teacher, I mean, I'm often in the role of teaching, but really more than being a teacher, I see myself as a community builder, community
Yes.
organizer, and a school builder, really. And
Right.
so I would love to hear, because we worked for many years building
Yeah,
educational programs
right.
and organizing a global community of people and trying to extend that in-person experience of
Yes.
spiritual camaraderie to a wider audience. So I would love any final thoughts you have about that kind of gathering and what that might look like today and
Yes.
value it might have for people today.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I mean, another big question. It's fascinating, Jeff, because I guess I'm still thinking about that in a way, because from the lessons we learned, the things that went wrong with that, and I've since discovered that that we weren't the first to do that, to have that. But exactly what you said, the core of that the kind of union that we experienced, and the creativity in that, the freedom, the love, and the joy, actually, which was when you said you first were drawn into it, and what's possible in that, because there's enormous possibility in that creativity. It really is, because people are engaging without wanting anything from each other, right? That's one of the things I felt, our memory is like, wow, there was so much trust between us at our best times. And of course that got very distorted and et cetera, but at its purest time, its best time, there was an enormous amount of trust and lack of preoccupation about self. And so when you have a lot of people with that, so how to do that? Because we obviously did that because we were in a very, as we know, enclosed community. We were very extraordinarily focused. We led a very austere life in a way, and a very, very focused, as similar to the life I lived in India on my own. But I think it's interesting. I think it's moved. I think there's a lot of those kind of communities, particularly in a Western setting, can be problematic the way we did for the obvious reasons. And yet I think finding like-minded people, and like-minded doesn't mean you all think the same, but you share this, what you're talking about. There's a recognition at a soul level, or however one talks of it, self level, finding those people and being, seeking those people out and spending time with those people in whatever form, whether that's small groups, larger groups, online groups, but I do think in person is very important too. I think it's critical because it's, and I think that we're challenged today because there's been such a history, as we know, of cults, and part of our community had very cultish aspects in the end, although I don't feel it was completely, there are a lot of cults, but it's difficult. It's a difficult model. And also I think the other thing that when I look back at what we did, what we engaged in, it's very easy for a community of that sort to become very inward focused. And even though our motto in a way, or our sort of tagline was that consciousness, the relationship between consciousness and culture, which is still the driving force for me. That's what really drives me, is that relationship. We weren't, we tended to be very inward. People didn't go out. People didn't really develop their own expressions independently enough anyway. And given we were together almost 3 decades. So I think, just to say, how do we do that? I think community is really, really important. I think there's a great hunger for it because we also live, as we know, in a world that's a lot of isolation, a lot of hyper-individualism. So wherever someone can find others to gravitate, and I think it's very, very important. And I think, I appreciate the work you're doing because you're doing that. You're trying to create that community online. But I'm finding it in lots of different ways, actually. And I have different circles that overlap and some don't overlap. But this idea of coming together with like-minded people, like-hearted people, is very, very important. And sometimes that can be around, a project, it can be around an idea, it can be around creating a new system or whatever, whatever it is. It can, but the heart of it, to me, what makes it different is what you're talking about here. The heart of it is this sort of sense, shared sense of the, whatever one calls it, the divine, the sacred, at the core of it, and the core of us. I think, but I think that's really important. I think there is a developing hunger for it too. I see that here in London, and there's different things going on, and you see that's what people really want. And when people do come together, it's profound what happens.
Thank you. Of course, many people who know me know that I was originally trained as an engineer. And the first lesson I learned as an engineer was that experiments never fail. They just end, and then you collect the data and create a new experiment. And I don't think all the data has been collected yet on our collective experiment, but some of the data has been collected. So we'll have to have another call to speak about that, because it is a complicated topic, but an important one, I think.
I think it is too. And I think
what things worked and what things didn't, and why is a really important thing to sort out.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's great, Jeff. And just to say, one of the things now, 5 years on, I think, or whatever it is, getting on 6 probably, what I find very interesting is that seed, that spark, that what we shared, that living presence that we were sharing together in depth, is actually, after, there's a long period of turmoil, and some people still is, but is beginning now to manifest in different ways, which is beautiful, right? In different ways amongst different groups of people, different, really, really interesting. And I think it's still early for, it's early on, as you said, I don't think the data has come in completely or been integrated yet completely, but it's happening, which is really amazing.
That's absolutely true. So Mary, thank you for talking today. You are a true sister in every sense. And of course, I love you dearly, as you know. And I can honestly say, I would be someone else if I hadn't had our relationship. You are definitely a person who has had a big impact on me in many, many ways. And I feel very grateful for our friendship.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I feel, very, very, very touched by that. And I would say it's fairly reciprocal. I feel I've always appreciated the spiritual sisterhood we've had and shared. And it's wonderful to talk again. It's really great. Yeah, I love this. Love to explore this and open it up.
So we'll do another one soon.
Absolutely. Yep, I'd love to. Thank you,
Jeff. So much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.